Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our HR and furlough update today. As is normal with the webinars that we've been running, we ask people to ensure that their microphone and the video connections are muted throughout the webinar. We do this because we have had some bandwidth issues in the past, but also it's to make it that much easier to manage as well. The topics that we're going to be talking about today are probably going to stimulate a lot of questions. Can I ask that any questions that you can keep quite generic are asked in the chat function? My colleague Ebony is monitoring that throughout the webinar, and she'll collate those and ask those questions to Shakira towards the end of the presentation. If you have any specific questions that you don't want to share on a relatively public forum, that's totally understandable. What we'd ask then is if you direct them directly to sbwinquiries@wales.coop, then our team there will send them back to us, and we'll try to get some form of answer as soon as we can, whether that's either from Shakira or whether that's from a business advisor. Okay, so some introductions. My name's David. I'm one of the project managers on Social Business Wales. Joined today by Shakira Joyner. Shakira is the MD of HC HR based here in Swansea, and also by my colleague Ebony. Ebony's a market development advisor who's normally based in our offices in Bangor. So I start these webinars normally with some useful links and a reminder of the resources and support materials that the Wales Cooperative Centre and Social Business Wales has put online for social businesses since the start of the crisis. So wales.coop/COVID-19 and the Social Business Wales pages on the Business Wales website. They're all updated with the same information. We review the information on it regularly and we update it where we can. For instance, Ebony's recently reviewed the governance documentation and updated that. For the purposes of today's presentation, I've also added the up-to-date guidance on the coronavirus job retention scheme. Because this is something that comes directly from UK government, it's worth checking back onto that one every so often, just making sure that you're up to date with any updates that they put onto that. Very quickly, before we go into the main body of the presentation, just some funding updates for those of you that may not have been aware of those. The local authority rates grants that have enabled businesses that qualify to receive a certain amount of funding directly through the local authority, they're actually coming to an end on the 30th of June. If you follow the link there, that'll give you some more information on that, but obviously that only leaves us with about 4 weeks for any remaining businesses to claim against that. Also some news on the Welsh Government Economic Resilience Fund. It's looking like the applications for that will be open again towards the end of June. We haven't got an exact date yet. The eligibility checker for the fund looks like it's going to go live mid-June. At the moment, it looks like the only major change that we can see to it is that the microfund or the funding for micro businesses, those businesses will no longer require to be VAT registered. And if that is true, that's really, really good news. But this is news in development, and we'll do updates on that as things progress. So a brief introduction to what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to be reviewing the coronavirus job retention scheme, or the furlough scheme as it sort of tends to be known, and update what we know at this point about recent changes. We'll be looking at some approaches to managing furlough and also to ending furlough. And we'll be looking at some return to work, some safe working practices. We'll also be looking at dealing with redundancies where that is a necessity. Towards the end of that then, Ebony will have collated your questions and we will ask Shakira some of those questions directly. I just want to say at the moment that in Wales, the message is very much focused on staying home and staying safe. In some of the other countries within the UK, that messaging is slightly different and more businesses are being asked to reopen. So I think the key thing at the moment is for us to consider our planning and to ensure that we're planning for our businesses reopening from now, if we're not already. And also really just to consider that who our stakeholders are within social businesses. Many social businesses have been set up with the express purposes of creating employment opportunities within their communities, and stakeholder management and transparency are just so important at the moment. So many people rely on social businesses, and I think it's just really, really important that we're as open as we can be as we go through this process. So I'm going to pass you on to Shakira, who's going to tell you a little bit about herself on the next slide.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for the introduction, David. My name is Shakira. I am an HR consultant, and I own a consultancy here in Swansea, but providing HR support throughout the UK. We provide pragmatic HR services and support to businesses that either have their own HR department or who need some HR support. Do you want to move to the next slide? Okay, so to start off, the coronavirus job retention scheme, announced on the 20th of March, it was designed to support and is designed to support employers whose operations have been severely affected by the coronavirus. It offers employers the chance to retain employees. That's the whole function of the furlough scheme, and the government is paying 80% of employees' wages up to a limit of $2,500 per month. This was originally due to end on the 30th of June. However, it has been recently announced that the scheme will be extended. The current format stays until the end of July, so you will still receive 80% up until the end of July. It will be extended up until October 2020, but we don't know actually what that format is going to look like. So August to October, there is going to be a different format. So possible changes to the scheme from August. It has been mentioned that employees will be able to return to work on a part-time basis, and that employers may be required to pay a percentage towards the salaries for furloughed employees. So the substitution payment, 80% or up to that threshold of 2,500 may be subject to change. So you may be asked to pay a percentage towards that. The guidance, which was last updated on the 14th of May, confirms that the scheme will continue though until the end of July with the 80%. So up until that point, you are still entitled to the 80% furlough payment. The new approach will run for the 3 months, so the 1st of August to the end of October, like we say. And more specific implementation details are to follow. We're actually hoping that these will come up over the next coming days, to be honest, in order to allow businesses to plan and forecast going forward. Next slide, okay. So what do we need to consider in terms of furlough? Well, furlough agreements may be required to be updated because of the changes that are to be announced. If you have already provided employees with a furlough agreement and entered into this since the start of the scheme, some of the requirement was that you were prohibited for working for that employer. So if your employer issued a furlough agreement, there were specific criteria which said you cannot carry out work whilst being furloughed. This is obviously going to be subject to change, we imagine, given that we're now saying that employees can work part-time for their employer. So it might be that you have to revisit your furlough agreement and or perhaps do a memo or amendment to that. Obviously, full details of the changes are yet to be announced, so it's important to ensure that employees consent to any variation, and this consent is obtained before the changes take effect and any new requirements of the scheme are addressed. So can an employer rotate furlough between its employees? So the employer's guidance states that employees must be furloughed for a minimum of 3 weeks, and the Treasury direction clarifies that 3 weeks means 21 calendar days. So we have to work in 3-week cycles at the moment in terms of furlough. I imagine employers, when the scheme is expanded on, will receive many requests from volunteers to be placed on furlough for multiple reasons in terms of caring responsibilities and just general health and safety risks. And also I think people are still a little bit unsure of how things are going to work in practice. So at the moment we are subject still to the minimum 3-week period, so we don't know whether that's subject to change. But the guidance does confirm that someone can be furloughed multiple times. So someone can be furloughed multiple times, but it's in tranches of 3 weeks. Is there a specific amount of time an employee has to work before going back on furlough? Currently, there's no guidance requiring an employee to return to work for a minimum period of time. However, if an employer is rotating furloughed employees, those return to work are likely to be back at work for at least 3 weeks, because obviously the cycles work in 3-week cycles. The reason why this is slightly unclear is they haven't actually been specific about whether you can just come back for 1 week and then be furloughed for another 3-week cycle, or even a couple of days. So what I'm suggesting is for you to bear in mind the anti-abuse provisions which are relevant to the CJRS, and that's a claim must not be under the CJRS if it's abusive or otherwise contrary to the exceptional purpose. The exceptional purpose being that this role would be at risk of being laid off or redundant had the scheme not be in place. So it sort of lends itself to thinking about, well, if you had worked for a period of time for this individual, do they and their role really need to be furloughed? So abuse of the scheme is open to scrutiny. So you just need to make sure that you have a clear business case as to why certain posts have been furloughed. So how does an employer decide who to put on furlough or who to come off it? I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can go about this. Initially asking for volunteers. Some people might be really keen to come back to work and to get back into some sort of routine. You may receive more volunteers than you can manage, and so you'd have to do some sort of selection criteria. The main thing is to look at what posts are actually needed within the business at that time. So it's posts rather than people, like in a redundancy selection criteria. And also the financial concerns that an employer might have. It might be that you can't immediately afford to have all 20, 30, 40 staff back at one time, that you need to use the furlough scheme in order to financially be able to afford to start back up again. If employee needs to be very urgently furlough employees or make them redundant in order to be able to continue to trade, a limited selection criteria may be used, and on this basis would be deemed as acceptable. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about redundancy consultation and criteria later in the presentation. So what information should an employer provide when it notifies an employee that their furlough leave is due to end? So in addition to the date of the end of the furlough leave, the employer should consider whether the following information will need to be provided. So the steps taken by the employer to ensure that it's a safe environment for employees to return to work, and any temporary contractual changes. So for instance, it might be that in order to maintain safe working practices, social distance rules and regulations, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail later, it might be that the employer has to stagger working hours, shift times, etc. And so that would be a temporary contractual change for that employee. Any potential temporary or permanent contractual changes needs to be discussed with the employee, and also needs to be signed off by the employee. So for instance, it might be that policy changes need to take effect, for instance, annual leave, what you're going to do about annual leave entitlements, etc. And also continuing terms and conditions, reminding employers and employees about health and safety, sickness policies, how they report on sickness and health and safety concerns. So what information should an employer provide when it notifies an employee that their furlough leave is due to end? So the temporary different ways of working, as we discussed previously, practicalities of returning to work as well, public transport, travel, how that employee is going to actually get to their place of work. Do they actually need to go to the place of work? Is it possible for home working to either continue or to start home working? Obviously measures to comply with social distancing requirements in the workplace, measures to reduce the spread of the virus, so any additional cleaning measures that are in force, minimising work-related travel and social contact, so the use of Zoom calls, team calls, online telephone rather than actual visiting sites, and also the responsibilities of staff, because you can have all the measures and practicalities and procedures in the world, but if not everybody's committed to following those, they're not going to work. So what information should an employer provide when it notifies an employee that their furlough leave is going to end? So special provisions that the employer is making for shielding of vulnerable employees, how an employee notifies their employer if they fall into this category. So for instance, if you are shielding, or you do have employees that are shielding, we need to see the medical evidence of that, or have a discussion with that person about obtaining medical evidence. Any allowances that need to be made for time spent on furlough in relation to performance reviews, performance and capability procedures, redundancy and selection. So it's about that continued communication with employees. Where an employee has been on furlough for an extended period, it would just be useful to have a catch up with them, like any return to work. You know, if someone's off for long-term sickness absence, it's good when they enter the workplace to just say, look, this is what's changed in your absence. This is what we're currently doing. I think, you know, for both employers and employees at the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty on both parts. So it's about continuing that open communication so that an employee has the opportunity to raise any concerns, and also the employer has the opportunity to say, look, I want you to feel comfortable and confident to come back to work. These are the measures that we put in place to protect you. Employers should also remember to also notify employees who have continued working on site throughout the lockdown, that obviously, you know, the above has been done. So don't forget those that have continued to work, that they also need to be updated and notified. So how should employees select which employees should return to work from furlough ahead of others? I think it has to come down to job roles and skills, what's required. Are all furlough staff needed to come back at the same time? We discussed earlier about the 3-week cycle. So can you rota and can you spread that people are going to come back at different times? And if any staff might be kept on furlough because their work is temporarily unable, or they're unable to work, for example, they've got caring responsibilities or are shielding, then it might be that they are kept on furlough for a longer period because of that. The main thing to consider as an employer is that you should ensure that there's no discriminatory criteria that are applied, and that you can justify your decisions that are made. So we talked a little bit about health and safety and safe working practices. So from a health and safety and well-being perspective, what are the employer's obligations about managing a return to work? So there is an implied duty to protect the health and safety of all employees, a duty to look after both mental and physical health and well-being, and to also protect the members of the public, clients, customers and contractors. So it's not just the immediate employees that you have within your business or your working environment. You also need to consider anybody who's visiting that. So public, clients, customers. There's a duty to manage the health and safety risks from the workplace itself. So that includes equipment, it includes cleanliness, washing facilities, and the provision of safe systems of work, possibly including provision of PPE, and that's obviously subject to availability and also the environment to which you work in. Also training around these new working practices, you know, how are you going to communicate these to members of your team prior to them coming to work? So you need to consider how you're going to communicate this with your staff. So when the time comes, how can employers plan and manage a safe return to the workplace? So obviously, some people have already started going back to work. Others are waiting to be allowed to return. So this is a good time actually to get your ducks in a row and to set your stall out about how you're going to return. So the starting point for me is to carry out a risk assessment. Now there's lots of guidance online with the HSE with regards to different workplaces and what this looks like. Obviously, an office environment would be very different to a manufacturer's, for instance. You need to look at consulting with your workers and trade unions if that's appropriate. So speaking to them about what are they concerned about, what have they thought of could be a risk to them and their role. And also I would really urge people to communicate the results of the risk assessment with staff to fill them with confidence that you're actually looking at how you're going to work going forward. Because unfortunately, I think as we sit here now, things aren't going to change overnight. We aren't just going to go back to the same way of working that we have done previously. It is going to be a phased return. And so I think you do need to ensure that staff well-being and that staff feel comfortable with the measures that are in place, that they've had adequate training, that the measures are workable, and obviously they can then be a part of developing the safe working practices, which obviously ensures buy-in from the staff from the start. So the next question is, what is the legal and moral position on encouraging versus mandating a return? And I think for a lot of businesses, this is going to be a really tricky one. It's a balancing act, essentially, because there's the legal position, which is that we have health and safety practices to make sure that both staff and employers are safe. But also with your business hat on, you need to start back up, because financially, in order to make sure that businesses are viable, they need to get back to work. So I think it's everything that we talked about previously. It's managing the health risk that employees will face in the workplace and also traveling to the workplace. It's balancing the financial pressures of the business. There could be that the furlough scheme may shortly have reduced payments before coming to an end. So I think as business managers, owners, you need to start strategically planning how you're going to ramp up your work, how you're going to afford, and perhaps it is going to be a mixture of using the furlough scheme, bringing people back in, testing your safe working practices. Does it actually work when you have 10 people in the office, but it doesn't work when you have 20 or 15? So how are you going to manage that? And also there's the practicalities of, childcare. In Wales, the schools remain closed. And so, there are lots of people with childcare responsibilities that are going to find it difficult to just go back to maybe their usual 9 till 5 role. So the CIPD have actually brought out some criteria for employers to think about when bringing employees back to work. And is it essential? So can people still work from home? Is it essential that that role returns to work? Is it sufficiently safe? So everything that we've been talking about in terms of a duty of care, identifying and managing risk, and is it mutually agreed? Like I've been saying, it's essential to have that clear dialogue with staff, that they understand the changes that have been imposed, they sign up to them, and that they are comfortable with returning, and having that mutual agreement will help you manage some of the issues as they present themselves. Okay, so redundancy and social business. Now, I think for a lot of you, this is an alien concept. A lot of businesses and social business that I've been working with, it's about creating jobs rather than looking at the other end of the spectrum. However, these are difficult times and they are unprecedented, and it does require sometimes difficult decisions to be made. And what I think I would want to stress is, even if you start planning now, you do not have to go through with the redundancy process. Between actually opening consultation and getting to that final end where a decision is made, so much can change. Staff come up with all sorts of variations, all sorts of ideas in order to keep roles, manage roles, reduce roles. That's why the law urges staff to have a proper and meaningful consultation with their employees, to make sure that, you could have thought or think you could have thought of every scenario, but actually until you actually start talking to the staff, there could be that one scenario that you didn't consider. So I know it's a scary prospect. I know it's not actually what a lot of you are about, but I think you can start looking at what actually you can afford, and then move from that point. So obviously, transparency is often ingrained within the way social businesses are run. So employees have a sense of ownership and are often highly engaged with the business aims and values. And a lot of the time, reducing or minimising jobs will actually go against what you originally set out to achieve. However, formal and informal consultation, as I said, could be beneficial. And as I said, could reduce hours work in order to actually not reduce headcount, working patterns. Some people might even say, I'm in a position that I could take a period of time unpaid. So they retain their job, it supports the business to continue, and actually you haven't actually made anybody redundant. Okay, so what if after everything and planning, you do have to consider making employees redundant? So redundancy is a potentially fair reason for dismissing an employee under the law. However, an employment tribunal will not treat a dismissal as a redundancy dismissal unless it is caused by the following. So the closure of a business, the closure of a particular workplace, or a diminished need for employees to carry out work of a particular kind. So for instance, you may have 10 people doing a certain role, however, because of the downturn, you now only have a need for 8 people to do that role. So in that scenario, you would have to consult with all 10 people and reduce the headcount to 8. It's important to consider when starting any redundancy process or redundancy consultation that it's the role, not the individual, that is made redundant. And that's really hard to get across to individuals when they are being consulted with, that it's not personal. It's about the fact that you can't afford the 10 people, that you need to reduce it to 8. There are some legal there's some legal processes that you have to also consider in terms of when you're making redundancies. So collective consultation is one. If an employee is proposing to dismiss as redundant 20 or more employees at one establishment within a 90-day or less period, it's under an obligation to consult with appropriate representatives of the affected employees. So the duty to consult collectively is in addition to your duty to consult individually. Any consultation has to happen with individuals on a one-to-one basis, and that individual has a right of accompaniment by either a colleague or a trade union official. So what if I need to consider making employees redundant and it's 100 or more affected? Well, different rules apply again. The consultation must commence at least 45 days before the first dismissal is to take effect. If 20 or more employees are affected, consultation must commence at least 30 days before the first dismissal. There is no obligation to consult collectively if there's 19 or fewer employees that are effective. Collective consultation should be completed well before the employer serves any notice of termination. And the relevant definition of redundancy for the purposes of collective consultation is a dismissal for a reason not related to the individual concerned. So that's what I was saying earlier, which is it's about the role, not the individual. So what must consultation include? So consultation needs to include avoiding the dismissal or the redundancy. So this is where you need to talk to individuals about the other options. So this is an opportunity to explore whether that person might go down to part-time hours, might be able to reduce their hours. Perhaps they are looking to voluntarily ask for redundancy. There's loads of different variations that can be considered at that point. Reducing the number of employees to be dismissed. So obviously during that period you would suspend recruitment, you would look at reduction in overtime, you would really look to be lean in terms of not taking on any other additional roles within the business at that time, and mitigating the consequences of dismissal. So can you, obviously you will need to offer redundancy payments if the person is eligible, but what also can you do? Can you offer some guidance in terms of CV writing? Are there other organisations that you know that are hiring at that moment that you could also make a referral to? The employer is also required to disclose certain information to the appropriate representatives in writing. So this must be the reason for its proposal, so the business case, the number and description of employees it proposes to dismiss as redundant, the total number of employees of that description employed at that establishment in question, the proposed method of selecting employees who may be dismissed, the proposed method of carrying out the dismissals, including the period over which the dismissals are to take effect, the proposed method of calculating the amount of any redundancy payments, and the number of agency workers working temporarily for and under its supervision and direction. So can an employer make furloughed employees redundant? Before starting any redundancy process, I think it's also key for me to mention that you need to check any grant or loan funding that you are receiving at the moment, any service level agreements, because it may be that if you are receiving funds or you're receiving a grant to pay for a particular post, you might not be in a position that you can make that role redundant. So I'd always urge you to go back and check that initially. The usual obligation to consult with staff about any redundancy proposals and allow them to comment on these before they are finalised, and the rules of fair consultation remain in place even during furlough, and you can consult with staff during furlough about redundancy. However, there are some things to consider in terms of the logistics around this, because obviously you will be consulting with staff remotely. What does that look like? How are you going to ensure that they can be accompanied for those consultations? So you just need to consider about how that's actually going to work in practice. Any questions?
Okay, so we're aware that there may be some quite specific scenarios around some of these issues. So if you do have any questions relating to this, you can contact Social Business Wales either via email or using our hotline number, which is 0300 111 50 50. We'll have the details at the end so you can check those and get in touch with us. I did want to mention as well that we are running a couple of, well, we're offering a couple of one-to-one sessions around governance. This has come out of some specific queries that clients have had relating to how to manage meetings and other governance issues during lockdown and during the pandemic. We have written a guidance note on this, which is available online. If you go to our COVID-19 hub, you can find it there. We also have these pre-bookable 20-minute sessions with a business advisor, and you can find booking details on Eventbrite. We've put the link up there for you.
Okay, thanks. It's for me to say thank you to Shakira. Obviously, there was a lot of information to take in this, so I very much hope you found that useful. If you do need more help from Social Business Wales, please contact us directly on 0300 111 50 50. Refer back to the websites I mentioned earlier on, or email us directly, either directly to your business advisor or via spwinquiries@wales.coop. Thanks again.